So, why is it that some goods are very responsive to a change in price, but other goods are not? That is, why is it that some goods have, in absolute terms, a very high price elasticity of demand, and other goods have a very low price elasticity of demand? We saw in a previous video clip that, as just an example, PlayStation consoles were relatively price elastic. They were quite responsive to a change in price. The demand was quite responsive to a change in price. Whereas in the case of chewing gum packs, the demand was not very responsive to a change in price. How can we explain these kinds of phenomena? Well, that's what we'll look at here. Economists have two basic types of explanation for why you get differences in price elasticity of demand. Why some goods are very responsive to a change in price and other goods' demand is not very responsive. The first reason is the expenditure as a proportion of income or of a person's budget. We would say that the larger the expenditure on a good as a proportion of a person's budget, the more demand will be responsive to a change in price. The more price elastic demand will be. And the smaller the expenditure on a particular good is as a proportion of a person's income or budget, the less price elastic the demand will be. So just to take an example, if we looked at the chewing gum example, chewing gum is a pretty cheap product, packet of chewing gum. If the price of chewing gum went up from 50 cents a pack to 80 cents a pack, this hardly makes any dent whatsoever in your budget. So even though the percentage change in the price is relatively large, the percentage change in your demand is going to be tiny. And the same goes for everyone else who buys chewing gum, presumably. So overall in the market, the percentage change in the quantity demanded due to a relatively large change in the price measured as a percent is going to be fairly small. But the more expensive goods become, the more responsive consumers are to a change in price. Okay. Another possible general reason why you get differences in price elasticity of demand between different goods is that some goods will have more substitutes to choose from than other goods. The more substitutes there are to choose from, the more price elastic demand will be. That is, the more responsive demand will be to a change in price. If you go to Flemington markets on the weekend, you'll see there are very many fruit and vegetable sellers, and say you're interested in buying oranges. There's many orange sellers at the markets. If any one of those orange sellers decides to increase their price by 10%, what will happen to the quantity demanded of their oranges? Well, the quantity demanded will fall very substantially because consumers, having lots of other orange sellers to purchase from, there being many substitutes in the market, will simply switch away from the more expensive oranges to the relatively cheaper oranges, which do pretty much the same thing. On the other hand, if we were looking at a product which has very few substitutes, then when the price of a good rises, there won't be much of a shift away on the part of consumers from that product because there's few alternatives to choose from. So, for example, if we took the case of, I don't know, let's make the situation imaginary and say Flemington Markets becomes a giant monopoly controlled by a single seller, and the price of oranges goes up, and you really want to get oranges. Where are you going to go? There's no alternatives anymore. There's no close substitutes now. So when the price rises, you're kind of forced to continue to buy the oranges. So the demand will be relatively unresponsive to a change in price in that case, because there are few substitutes to choose from. We should bear in mind when we're talking about substitutes that there are many factors which can influence that. It's not just the simple case which I just described of, well, there's oranges sold by this person and there's oranges sold by another person and oranges sold by yet another person. Because we could be talking about the influence of time. In fact, sometimes textbooks will include time as a separate determinant of price elasticity of demand. That is, the more time that consumers have to choose, the more price elastic demand will be. But this is really a case of substitutes, because when we say that a consumer has more time, what we mean is they have more time to search for substitutes. If, for example, it's going to rain in the afternoon, and it's the morning, you have some time to search around for an umbrella. So you'll have quite a few alternatives to choose from. And you can be very selective. Anyone who raises the price of their umbrellas in the morning, when it's sunny, is going to suffer a substantial fall in the quantity demanded for their umbrellas. Why? Because people have time to go around looking for alternatives. But what if you didn't know it was going to rain in the afternoon, and so the afternoon comes, you haven't bought an umbrella, and it starts raining, and now the only umbrellas that you can easily have time to find are right next to where you're working, for example. Now you don't have time to go and search for substitutes. You have to choose, in the very limited time available, what there is. And that might only be one umbrella seller outside your building. When they increase their price, the quantity demanded is likely to fall not very much at all, because consumers have no alternatives available to them. If there's more innovation that occurs, and this again is connected to time in a way, the more time available, the more opportunity firms have to innovate and come up with new alternatives to the existing products which are available in the marketplace. So the more innovation there is, the more product innovation there is, the more product proliferation there is, the more substitutes there will be. And so for all of the firms in the market who are producing alternative products, if in that case they increase their price, they're likely to suffer from a large fall in the quantity demanded. Demand will be quite responsive to a change in price. Biology is another factor. So the classic example here is insulin for diabetics. Biology determines that there are few substitutes available. Or for, if we were talking about drugs to which people can become addicted, this becomes a biological determinant of the number of substitutes available. If you become addicted to crack cocaine, then there's going to be few substitutes for crack cocaine. And therefore, when the price goes up, consumers of crack cocaine are likely to continue purchasing. That is, the quantity demanded will fall only a tiny bit. Psychology and advertising can also play a role in influencing your perceptions about what kind of substitutes are available. So if some clever advertising is able to convince you that there are few substitutes for a BMW, then when the price of BMW rises, the quantity demanded will not fall substantially. Because if you believe there's few alternatives available. Or it doesn't have to be something like cars, it can be soft drinks. So if you believe that if you've been convinced that Coca-Cola is the best and only soft drink to consume, then when the price of Coca-Cola goes up, the quantity demanded won't decrease very much, because in the consumer's mind, there's no good substitutes. And of course, cultural factors can also influence the perception of the number of substitutes available. So let's think of an example. If we took the case of rice, for someone like myself, rice is pretty much rice. So all the different varieties of rice which exist are all equally good as far as I'm concerned. So there's many good substitutes for any particular brand of rice. It's all the same to me. So if the price of jasmine rice goes up, then I will switch to another rice because it's all the same stuff. However, in some cultures, there are fine distinctions made between different kinds of rice. Some rice is very good for a particular kind of dish, other rice is particularly good for another kind of dish, and so on and so forth. And there's the different sizes of the grains and where they're harvested, and all of this matters. So, for example, if you wanted to make, sticky rice, white sticky rice, then for people in certain cultures, especially, say, for example, in Southeast Asia, you'll want jasmine rice from Thailand. And you won't want it from anywhere else. All the other rice is useless for this kind of product. In which case, when the price of jasmine rice rises, the quantity demanded won't fall as much, because from the perspective of people from that particular cultural grouping, there aren't any good substitutes for jasmine rice from Thailand. Okay? So culture can influence what you perceive as substitutes. Okay, so in summary, we've got two major factors which can influence the price elasticity of demand. Expenditure on the product as a proportion of someone's income or budget, and the number of substitutes available. The cheaper something is, the less price elastic it is. And the fewer the substitutes available, the less price elastic it is. Okay, let's look at some examples. Take petrol. When the price of petrol goes up, the quantity demanded decreases in Australia, roughly, this is just rough numbers, roughly by 1.2%. Is demand price elastic or price inelastic? Well, we can see that the effect is smaller than the cause in absolute terms. 1.2% is smaller than 10%. So we would say that petrol is price inelastic. But our question is, why? Why is it price inelastic? Well, think of our two major determinants. Are there many substitutes for petrol? Well, at least not in the short run anyway. Unless you want to get your car converted to some other fuel source. In any given week, there's going to be few substitutes available for petrol. We're a very car-dependent society, and we're a very petrol car-dependent society. So when the price of petrol goes up, the quantity demanded doesn't go down by very much. People need their petrol because they need to drive around in their cars, especially if you live in the western suburbs. If you lived in the eastern suburbs or the centre of the city, or where most politicians live, then you'll probably have decent public transport. But as you move further and further away into the west, then you're going to become more dependent on cars. And so the price of petrol, changes in the price of petrol, will have a smaller influence on the quantity demanded of petrol. Also, petrol expenditure these days, thanks to the greater fuel efficiency of cars, is a relatively small amount of people's budgets. For the medium-sized car these days, a medium-sized four-cylinder car these days, then you'll spend about 5 to 10% of your weekly budget on petrol, which is not a giant whack. So both of these factors together ensure that we've got relatively price inelastic demand for petrol. What about coffee? In the case of coffee, when the price of coffee goes up by 10%, the quantity demanded falls by only 2.5%. So we can again say this is price inelastic demand because the effect is, in absolute terms, is smaller than the cause. Why is it that coffee is price inelastic? It's relatively unresponsive to a change in price. Well, you can probably guess at the answer. There's few substitutes for coffee because caffeine is an addictive substance, and also because expenditure on coffee per week is a relatively small amount of people's budgets. So again, both of these factors tend to reinforce an inelastic demand for coffee. What about cigarettes? Well, you can probably guess cigarettes are going to be pretty much in the same category as coffee. 10% increase in the price of cigarettes tends to lead to a 3.2% decrease in the quantity demanded. That's more than is the case for coffee, but nonetheless we can still say that demand is price inelastic because the effect in absolute terms is smaller than the cause. Why is it? Again, there's few substitutes. Nicotine is an addictive substance, and despite the increases in taxes that have been put on cigarettes, a weekly expenditure on cigarettes is still not a giant slab out of anyone's budget. It's not 90% of their budget. It's still going to be about 10 to 15% of their budget, like petrol or, to a lesser extent, coffee. So, again, we've got factors which tend to feed into price inelastic demand for cigarettes. What about a restaurant meal at a particular restaurant? Well, in this case, a 10% increase in the price on average will result in a 23% decrease in the quantity demanded. Why is that? Well, there's two factors at work. So we've got price elastic demand. We can clearly see the effect in absolute terms, 23% decrease in the quantity demanded, is greater than the cause, a 10% increase in the price. Why is demand price elastic in the case of a restaurant? One, there are lots of good substitutes to choose from. So if the restaurant you've been going to increases their price by 10%, you might think, let's just go to another restaurant. I mean, there's heaps to choose from. They're all performing pretty much the same kind of function. Not exactly, but pretty much the same kind of function. You go in the place, you sit down, they have crappy music, you order off a menu, other people prepare the food, you eat it, and then they do the dishes. It's great. So, no matter what restaurant you go to, you're at least going to get that. So, since there's many substitutes, many alternative restaurants to choose from, when your restaurant increases their price, the quantity demanded can fall substantially. Demand will be very responsive to that change in price for a particular restaurant. We're not talking about all restaurants together for a particular restaurant. So, many good substitutes available. Also, going to a restaurant every day or every evening can really add up. It can become quite expensive. So, for example, if you spend $100 a day for a good restaurant for 2 people every night, that's going to take up to 60% of the average weekly income. You say, well, $100 a night on food, that seems a bit steep. You can find cheaper restaurants than that. Yeah, you could. What if you ate at a restaurant for lunch and dinner at a cheaper restaurant? Still going to be about $100 a day. So 60% of your average weekly income. So it's a large slab of income. So both of these factors work together to contribute to a highly price elastic demand. What about marijuana? There's lots of debate about marijuana, whether it's particularly addictive or not. And so we can look at price elasticity of demand to try and figure out what's going on with that. If it's an addictive substance for the majority of the consumers, then we would expect it to have a low price elasticity of demand coefficient, kind of like cigarettes or coffee. So it turns out that when the price of marijuana goes up by 10%, the quantity demanded falls by 26%. It's kind of like a restaurant meal. So it's very responsive to a change in price. That is, demand is highly price elastic. Why is that the case? Well, I don't know. I don't know anything about the marijuana market. I'll leave you to investigate that matter.